Yes,
no, sorry, can I just interrupt? Perhaps we should explain to Chris that we record these sessions just for our own purposes. They're not, they're not streamed anywhere, but they're available if people who aren't here want to catch up or whatever. So yeah, hopefully you're happy with that. But you can always switch off your picture if you're not.
No, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Hi, so I'm Lisa. I'm a PhD student in epidemiology at the Disease Dynamics Unit in Cambridge. My PhD is specifically focused on the interface between modelers and policymakers during pandemics. Early days in the PhD, but I'm bringing sort of as much to it as I can. Valerie and Dennis have asked me to sort of coordinate and I guess organize this group. Because you just you need someone to do that to make progress, collate all the ideas and such forth.
And you had, if I remember rightly, I can't remember what it was, but you had relevant background before the PhD, didn't you?
Yes, yeah. So I've worked as an infectious disease epidemiologist at London School prior to my PhD as well. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. So, well, I'm Valerie, for those, I think just about everybody knows. I'm one of the epidemic modelers that's involved in organising this. I'm at UCL.
Me too. Was it Harriet Watt? Now, well, retired for quite a long time, really, but hopefully people don't notice. Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Swallow, a lecturer in statistics at the University of Glasgow, particularly interested in Bayesian models for Bayesian statistics for stochastic models, including epidemiology, ecology, and systems biology.
Hannah?
Hi, I'm Hannah Clapham. I'm an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore in the School of Public Health. I'm an infectious disease modeler. Pre-COVID, I worked mainly on dengue and was based in Vietnam before this, working on dengue there, and I've worked in a number of institutions. But now has spent basically the last year, I guess, doing COVID modeling in Singapore and in for a number of low and middle income countries, mainly in Asia, I guess. So,
yeah. Chris Dent, Professor of Industrial Mathematics in School of Maths at the University of Edinburgh. So I've been interested recently in, well, particularly issues of evidence and data communication in COVID, which I'm not I don't have any background in epidemiology, but I do have a lot of interest and experience in use of data and modelling in policy arising from work in the electricity industry, particularly electricity security of supply, which is another which is another area in which modelling can make front page headlines. So I think there is some useful analogy to be had there.
Hi, I'm Duncan Robertson from Loughborough, also at Oxford. So I'm mainly interested in agent-based modelling, but lots of different sort of types of spatial modelling. And I was doing some epidemic modelling, mainly with animal diseases before this started. And I suppose I've been sort of concentrating on validating some of the London School models. So, but I'm mostly interested in the interface with policy at the moment. So, yeah.
Carry on.
Hi, sorry, I'm half running a Zoom meeting with students, but no one's turned up. So if they do turn up, I'll have to walk out. So it's a catch up for those without A-level maths. Yeah, I'm a postdoc at Cambridge. I'm currently in plant sciences. Most of the work I do is funded by DEFRA on tree diseases. I used to work at VLA when it was called VLA, I don't know what it's called now, APHIS something, modelling Scrapie, and worked on BSE. So I've been working on stuff that's kind of quite policy driven for most of my career.
Sorry, can I just, Lisa, would it be okay, when you send out the invites to put some sort of diary thing in as well, sort of diary invitation?
Yes.
That'd be great.
Yep. Yeah, like a Google Calendar thing.
Well, yeah, just MS Teams sort of
Yeah.
Outlook.
Yep, I can do that.
Information. Thanks.
So yes, Lisa, how do you like to? Because we've got this draft which I started, which you and Hannah have added to. Should we work our way through that?
Has everybody got access to that? Chris, have you got
Yes. I've got access. Yes, I've had a look at it. No, I can't remember quite how I had access to it.
Not to worry. No,
maybe in an email.
As long as everybody's got what they need.
If someone could put the link in the Zoom chat, that would be useful. So, thanks.
There we are. That's super.
I signed everyone up to the Dropbox by inviting them from the Dropbox, which I think sends you all an email. But whether you end up like me as with the Dropbox, just looking as though it's one of your own file folders, I don't know. Perhaps that's different for different circumstances.
No, that certainly is how I see it.
Anyway,
Lisa's put it there, so that should be fine.
The latest version is it's with initials HC for Hannah at the end. So that's the one we should look at, which is, and it's got track changes, so you can see who's guilty of which bit. And the sort of thinking behind the original draft was to really try and look at it from completely holistic viewpoints. So, if we work our way down, we may say these are intractable and interesting political problems which we don't really have expertise on. But I think, if the most important questions are not within our expertise, we don't want to just pretend they don't exist. So,
Dennis,
I think you can. Well, I suppose you can have a. So, I mean, some of the challenges, perhaps in that sense, are sort of one-liners, like the things to do with the difficulties of international collaboration between governments, for instance, where it's quite plain that if international governments collaborated better, all sorts of things could be improved. So, but obviously, so what we should be concentrating on is pointing to the improvements that collaboration might make possible.
Can I just ask what the sort of outputs that we're thinking about are with this? I mean,
well, the structure of the latest news is that we're probably aiming for Epidemics, which is the journal that we produced a volume of challenges 6 or so years ago now. And the format which we felt worked really well and would like to repeat is that so we've got here 10 themes provisionally, and of which politics and policy is one. And each one appears as a paper, and then within each paper, the focus is on trying to define challenges. And it might be that in this area, we have 1 or 2 very short challenges because they're really challenges for somebody else that we just want to mention. But if they're challenges we feel we can say something useful about, then for each challenge, you might devote half a page or a page, and you're trying as concisely as possible to indicate relevant background, say what the challenge is, and maybe give 1 or 2 suggestions of directions that might be helpful in meeting this challenge. So typically, I think the number of challenges in the previous volume range from about 4, somewhere between 4 and 12. So with sort of half a page or a page devoted to each. And then you probably have an introduction to the whole chapter, and you may want to have a discussion at the end. But the idea, which originally came from Jamie Lloyd Smith, I think, was that it was perhaps a helpful way of writing about future pandemics, and would be a little bit different from the way other people are doing it, to try and point to research challenges in that sort of way.
I think the idea, if we can, is to think about, or at least it was in the past, was to think very much about challenges where epidemic modelers could contribute and had something useful to say. I think with this set, and particularly perhaps this one, it's a much broader topic than we had before, and it's going to be harder to see that. And I think that's why we might have things which are obvious challenges, but we're not particularly experts to do more than just sort of say this is a challenge. But it may not be a challenge for modelers particularly any more than anybody else. So I think, but one of the advantages, I mean, we haven't totally settled all this yet, but one of the advantages of the epidemics journal is that they're very flexible as to the form of papers and output. And so it may be that, you know, we have the challenges papers. We may also, we're talking about having 1 or 2 tutorial type papers on particular areas of like UQ, for example, uncertainty quantification, where the methodology needs to be sort of explained to a wider audience. And one can imagine that actually we could have a range of different sorts of papers that would be gathered together within this volume. So I think we should think fairly generally about what would be useful and go on from there.
Yeah, I think that, again, I think the present thinking is that perhaps the volume, special issue, whatever, might consist of the 10 themes we've got, but also, almost as appendices, a number of sort of spin-off papers that have come out related to it, where the ones to do with estimation and bringing in new approaches to estimation is one of them.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question, well, a related question to what Valerie just said about the what kind of style of writing are we looking at here? I mean, is this something where we need articles to be fully referenced in a scientific paper style? Is it more a sort of I don't know what we'd refer to in engineering science as a sort of professional magazine style, where you have general references but not, you know, not detailed scientific citations?
I think the idea is sort of research paper style, but I think I think also the idea was, because if you get a paper that's covering, let's say, 8 challenges, and each one might need its so trying to be very tight, if that's the right word, in the amount of referencing. So to try and think carefully about, for each challenge, as to whether one can give some pretty short list of papers that provide the background on what that challenge is. The previous challenges volume is easily accessible, as they say. It's you can find it on the IDP pages of the Newton, or if anyone has problems with it, I'm fairly sure it's on Slack somewhere, but anyone has problems, let me know and I can. I
think it's been put in the Dropbox somewhere, but
actually, I think the whole collection is in the Dropbox. I think yes.
It's in the IDP. It's in the IDP Dropbox. There's 215 challenges in modelling infectious diseases, etc. So the whole volume is there at the top level in the IDP Dropbox.
Right, that show how we did it. Yeah, of course we don't have to do it exactly the same, but that seems.
They're certainly well cited. I know.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of references. There's basically, I want to say something very general. here's a paper that says the general thing for me. So.
Yeah, I've just added the link for the policy paper from 2015 to the chat if anyone just wants to take a quick look.
Thanks.
Can I just comment on the content, I guess, of the politics and the policy?
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's interesting to raise things that we can't say anything about and to put those in there. I do think it is worth trying to focus a little bit on modeling and the interface with politics and policy and how those kind of things interact, because I think that's what, as you say, that's what we can best speak about, and it kind of makes sense within this. And I think, you know, we can also have things in there we think this is important, but it's not within our realm. But I think there is quite a lot there at that interface, and it would be worth trying to think about those things. But maybe other people disagree. I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is something where, in terms of, I mean, I don't think this is quite a bold statement to make. But I don't think any of us are political scientists. Yeah. But what we do have, I think what we do have collectively is a lot of experience in model-based or data-driven decision support from different angles. So we certainly, I think, from that perspective, are well placed to lay down a high challenge in terms of this is, these are the issues in play about how using modelling well in this sort of very uncertain circumstance looks, and say there are challenges in how one actually implements this when the ultimate decision makers are largely not part of the world with technical modelling backgrounds. So you have that sort of communication issue about what science can and can't do for you.
And I suppose it's sort of saying about what's the best practice generally, what's the best practice in a crisis. And,
yeah,
you know, at the moment it is structured in terms of the modelers are so remote, 2 levels, well, if not 3 levels remote from the policymakers. So perhaps it's sort of building models with policymakers.
Yeah. But one thing that's not very clear to me is probably some of you are closer to this is how the layer of aggregation of evidence works, and what kind of expertise there is in the loop in precisely this point of how to use modelling and scientific evidence in this sort of crisis situation where you have to. I mean, you have to do things in a sense. You have to, in a kind of crude sense, you have to do things quicker than you can produce the kind of evidence that you'd really like, either because simply it takes a while to put modelling together, or simply that there's a lot that is unknowable in the early stages.
So I think a key point is capacity building. So funding work prior to an outbreak. It's been obviously done a bit more so in the case of human diseases with the influenza emergency practices and so on that maybe didn't in practice work that well, but funding basic infrastructure so that there are modelers and people collecting data ready, already experienced, and able to come together as groups as well. So I think animal health to a certain extent led the way on collaboration between groups, but definitely still some fighting and funding. But what was noticeable in the recent plant health and animal health call from DEFRA is that the animal health people all had to sign to say that they would meet whenever the government decided to have some big workshops. Plant health, nope. We're just competing against each other for tenders. So it's bringing that expertise together and policy facilitating that in the way that they fund it long term.
Yeah, and I think also having the right kind of, oh goodness, it's one of these points where everything comes together in terms of structures and skills and will and so on in the decision in the link between the decision making layers in government and the scientific or modelling advice, because I mean this is something where I've got little direct experience in epidemiology, but quite a lot in energy policy. Where I mean, for instance, one point which is at the heart of discussions around the Newton Institute, but is completely alien to thinking in mainstream energy community, is looking systematically at the relationship between model world and real world. And it's that and how you get how appropriate thinking along those lines is embedded in, for want of a better word, the system. I should just say I need to leave. Unfortunately, I need to leave very soon. So this Tuesday morning time was basically good for me, except today.
It's no problem. Thank you for do leave whenever you.
So I'll just drop off in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I was looking at the last paper, the one that Lisa just posted. That the challenges remarkably pertinent today too, aren't they?
Yes.
Just sort of get them across.
Yes, I think as I was making notes on our draft, I was looking at the 2015 and I was just sort of like writing the same thing.
Yeah.
And there's a point there.
That point is worth making, though, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. Just there's a cycle of reports and lessons being learnt, and the infrastructure doesn't change as a result.
Yes. I think I felt only one of the points wasn't relevant. I think item 2 or something was about sort of long-term modelling. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. I think she's in her other Zoom call.
Yeah.
I think she has a student. Yes, so I think the only point that wasn't relevant from 2015, I think it was item 2 or something, was more about sort of long-term, I guess, non-pandemic modelling. But yeah, certainly everything else was scarily relevant.
Sorry, that was a normal supervision student coming too early. Normally, term will be finished. This is the last one.
Yes. So do we want to now, so we've had some discussion about scope, which I think is really important to do first. Do we now want to take a look at what we've got so far with the draft? So Dennis wrote up the draft of sort of what had been discussed so far, and then Hannah and myself have added a few sort of comments and things. But it's very early days, so we could quite easily be missing key aspects, and we don't necessarily have all angles at the moment.
Yeah, that would be good. Do you want to start on the stages thing, or do you want to start with the themes?
Yes, hang on, I've closed it myself, 2 seconds. Here we go. Okay.
Yes.
So anything anyone wants to add for the themes running through?
Well, I'll start even above that, the headlines.
Okay.
You've said we will not criticise the UK's COVID-19 response. I think if we're going to say anything useful about future pandemics, I think we have to implicitly criticise a whole lot of countries' COVID responses, and but absolutely in a way looking forward, not back. And also, I think trying to disentangle, insofar as that may be possible, things that perhaps are almost impossible to get right, and things which actually are not too difficult to get right, and with, you know, and with the right change, whether it's a political, cultural, international collaboration or whatever. You know, I mean, I realize there's a danger in treading on expertise we don't have, but I do actually think in this that I'm not convinced anyone has expertise. I mean, and I think, and I think that if any kind, I mean, it may well be that the kind of mathematics which might offer useful insights is game theory, because I think if you look at, you know, the ways in which countries play a game, the ways in which countries do or do not take decisions to treat a pandemic in various ways, which we as modelers would suggest they ought to, and you ask why they don't do that, I think game theory potentially might offer some useful insights. So it might be worth. I don't know if we got among our number anyone who's more up on sort of game theory.
So we've got a PhD student who's been working on game theory. She's at the end of her second year, I think, in relation to plant disease epidemic control. So I could talk to her to see if that's something you want to bring in. I'm sure she'd be very keen.
And I think the, you know, I mean, there's such obvious dilemmas which are like those sort of, the sort of simple. I'm not thinking of any sort of deep sort of game theory, but just some of the fairly simple things you tend to read about in general articles about this kind of problems with, you know, prisoner's dilemma and things like that. And I think it's summed up in Michael Baker's from New Zealand, one of his comments, and in his the first talk I heard from him this year was the little cartoon which sort of said, in dealing with a pandemic, you know, how will we know that we were successful? And the answer is, we'll know we were successful if people say we overreacted. Which is absolutely classic sort of little game theory dilemma, isn't it? I mean, that's so I mean, I would like to. So I do think it's something we could do as modelers, is to look at the various stages when a pandemic starts. And obviously, one of the things about a pandemic when it starts is you don't know it's going to be a pandemic. You know, it's one of the 3 out of 100 cases which are showing those signs at this moment that will be a pandemic. You've got to be aware that the other 97% of cases won't turn out to be pandemics. So how do you persuade a government to say, look, this is a 3% chance, and you probably don't even know it's a 3% chance. You know, you have to sort of, in some sort of qualification way, you say it's a scale 2 on a 5-point scale. It's a, you know, we should move to this level of readiness and be prepared to act instantly. And if you're trying to persuade a government to be ready to throw billions or close down all flights in or out of the country or something in a speculative way, you can quite see why governments are very, very likely to say, let's wait a few more weeks and see what happens. And as with all the lockdowns, I mean, pretty much every country that locked down, with just a few exceptions, but certainly all the European countries that locked down, every one of them is looking back and saying, why didn't we lock down 3 weeks earlier? We would have saved 90% of the deaths, at least in the first wave. I mean, what would have happened subsequently, of course, speculative. But and the reason was this difficulty in acting politically until you're a bit more certain. So
and the accusation.
You don't want to say a great deal about those things, but I think that they have been well written about by various commentators, and I think they are very important problems. So, I mean, there may be the kind of sort of challenges we devote just 1 or 2 lines to. We just point out that there is a challenge and try and put it as clearly as we can, and then maybe point to people who have written about it. So that's all in the. So that's all. That takes us as far as line 2 of the draft.
I think that's a good point. Is when do you react? So on the plant side, one of our issues at the moment is Emerald ash borer has devastated ash in America. There's some uncertainty about whether the UK ash is going to be resistant. And so the cautious approach would be to put up traps now and just look out for it. And when it comes, stamp it out as quickly as possible. But that costs lots of money. And so, and we might be wrong. Like I might be wrong as a modeler. So maybe they're right. Maybe Fraxinus excelsior is resistant enough to stop the pest doing it much damage. So when do you get them to invest? And how do you ever prove you were right if your investment means nothing happens?
Well, I suppose it's building up the capacity for sort of proactive surveillance rather than reaction. And maybe that's very specific, but you know, it's that surveillance activity which I think can be built up and is never
really expensive.
Exactly, it's never a good investment until it is. But as you say, if it's very specific to, you know, a plant disease, it may, and then you sort of build in the sort of cost benefit side of things as well. And you know, there's criticism about, you know, today about the economic modelling not being integrated with the epidemic modelling. So it's sort of capacity building to be able to, and also to be able to sort of answer these questions fairly quickly, as opposed to building up the infrastructure to be able to answer the questions. But as you say, it requires investment and, you know, decision.
I think perhaps I'm jumping ahead here, but I think the economic modelling not being integrated with the disease modelling is precisely the kind of thing that's gone wrong with the UK response. I mean, yeah. I mean, so I'm probably digressing here again, but but I think part of the reason for the UK response is that we are such a large country with such a lot of expertise, and also you know, a very well, a long experience of organising things in government, which gives us perhaps a rather arthritic sort of structure. The end result of which is you have that, you know, if you look at the policy framework in the UK, you've got the various people who are offering expertise off in sort of separate silos, and their advice is supposed to go up, and then it's politicians sticking it together. Well, first civil servants and then politicians. Well,
I suppose that's the point, isn't it? I mean, politicians' instinct is to survive and to be able to blame other people, if you're being quite cynical. And you know, that you can argue that's why the structure of the epidemic modelling was set up as such, that you've got several layers of isolation from the political decisions, which doesn't make the best political decisions, but keeps people in their positions.
You could almost say it's sort of keeping the experts in different silos so that you've always got a reason for not taking advice from any one set of them. I mean, I think it's
I think that integration is really important.
I've had
I think we could. Yeah.
Sorry, I was only saying I have had the impression from, and I can't think where, but in maybe New Zealand is one of them, but in some countries that we've heard from, the modelers are much closer to the politicians and the decision makers. There aren't these sort of levels, but the meetings are direct and not, you know, going through some intermediate levels.
Because it was depressing, really, actually, finding the kind of questions that SPI-M were being asked to look at. You know, would opening schools for alternate weeks rather than alternate fortnights work out better? Well, you know, that's all assuming that opening or closing schools is an important intervention at this particular moment. Seem to be cutting off from, whereas what you should have been doing, obviously on, a lot of guesswork on, but nevertheless trying to do your best on, to get best thing out of scientists would have been to say, you've got a whole range of possible interventions, closing pubs, restrictions on travel, social distancing, all the rest of these things. Can you somehow stick them all into a model which connects them up in some rough way with the likely economic or mental health, whatever implications, and then run some sort of simulations? And and probably models at an early stage would have come out wrong, but at least you'll be doing things like you'd be doing the kind of broad modeling, which would say, we've looked at it and actually, these kinds of interventions seem to be cost effective and those kind of interventions don't seem to be cost effective. And instead of which they're being asked, the politicians are deciding that a particular intervention, like whether to open pubs or not, is important politically, and they therefore want to know whether to open pubs. And
how much is
and they try and make force modelers to answer what's effectively a silly question.
But how much is that our responsibility as modelers to be doing the sensible questions? So we know that having worked especially in at VLA, I got phoned up quite frequently with random questions that had been passed down from the minister that I'd spend 2 weeks working on, and then they'd lost interest by the time. And they were just little sides distracting you from doing that bigger modelling that as a scientist is more sensible to balance everything up and not just look at the pubs. And so as scientists, we need to kind of have the capacity to be able to be doing that in the background. Well, I
think that's a very good point, that you need the sort of, it's kind of strategic, if you like, modelling, which is looking at, that building up the model, if you like, or a series of models. And you almost need the fast response modelers to say, to react to the whims of the politicians, to say, so you almost need two groups, the interface plus the sort of, infrastructure from the modelling side.
Yeah, that's really nice.
I agree. And I think there's also something there around co-creating those questions. So we shouldn't assume that the questions have to be the non-relevant questions that come from the policymaker, that if you have that continual interaction, then you start to have a role in the questions that they are asking, and then kind of having that.
It's the model building with the policymakers as opposed to for the policymakers. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. And that kind of like that. Pushing, and I think a little bit, as you say, of pushing back about. So that's something I've always found hard of being. If you ask a question, and if it's something you can't do with your model, then it's very easy to say, well, I can't do this, so I can't answer that question. But if it's something you can do, but you think you shouldn't. That's a harder thing to kind of turn around and
sort of model creep
as
well,
because
because suddenly
exactly.
end up in the model, whereas they weren't before.
Right. Exactly, that's right. And maybe that's fine, but maybe that's not. And you sort of keep saying yes because you want to still be in the room and you want to be the person they come to answer these questions. But at some point you have, the sort of what's the onus on the modeler to say, actually, that's, not something we can reasonably do. But then you also have the issue of the modeler then bringing in their own sort of judgment about these things, which is, something that we also have to think about.
And I suppose that's a sort of example, as well as the sort of pubs perhaps being a political thing. There's also the point that the policymakers know how things work. Obviously, the care home example being a good one, that they know that these are the interactions which cause, and so it's almost kind of there isn't any this co-creation of the model, I suppose, which is kind of missing.
Or co-creation with public health experts as well.
Well, that's a good point.
I think there's potential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For And even coming from government, so I got asked last year to do something. There was an outbreak in Kent of a pest, and I got asked to do some modelling, but I wasn't invited to any of the meetings with the people in the field. And some of the people in the field were positively resistant. We haven't been able to publish it because we can't get the data, detailed, proper data, publishable data on the traps, because there was resistance to modelling work, because there's still a view, which is to a certain extent valid, that modelers come in and steal data and get the good publications and the glory, while other people have done all the hard work of collecting it. So it's making sure that policy somehow help to facilitate with communications between different disciplines.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I've jotted it down to be added in, woven in somewhere.
I wanted to go back maybe to your initial point, Dennis, about this risk communication early on and the kind of risk of something bad happening. I wonder if we beat ourselves up quite a lot about that, but actually part of the issue might be not that modelers were not believed, it was that it wasn't cared if that happened. They didn't, there was a level of not caring if transmission got out of control. I don't know that that's the case, but I think it's sort of worth maybe thinking about that. We spend a lot of time saying, oh, should have communicated that better, should have told that better. But you can communicate these things up, and even if people believe you, if they don't care that happens, then it doesn't matter how well you've ultimately.
Well, I think that was another thing about, you know, the communication of the scientific advice. I mean, early on, I think it was March, when Mark Halpin of the Behavioural Insights Group was talking about it going through the sort of herd immunity type thing, and that really didn't help. So who's seen as a scientific modeler or, you know, scientific expert is, so, you know, there's almost kind of corruption of that, which I think, you know, went on early on.
I think, yes, I think there was there's an element there of sort of the thing they were expecting was flu, wasn't it? And I suppose that the, at least, and that I don't think humans have ever tried to stop flu spreading, you know, other than through vaccination. So,
well, they did in the 1918 or whenever it was.
Sorry.
In the pandemic of 1900.
I mean, if you go back to the Spanish flu pandemic, people did have lockdowns and things like that. I read once they got going, but I think I may be wrong, but I think the sort of expectation was a bit sort of for a bit on the, it's going to go around anyway, and most of the sorts of flu we've had haven't had that higher level of that higher death rate, so probably we'd just sort of put up with it. And I think,
well, I suppose,
yeah,
you know,
I think that sort of, isn't that an element of where the sort of thinking maybe went slightly wrong in this case?
I mean, the very fact it's called SPI-M is sort of a, you know, influenza.
Exactly, it's pandemic. It was pandemic who they were thinking of, yeah. So, I mean, one of the most difficult things about writing this paper is to try and imagine it's a pandemic of, you know, disease X. I mean, which may either look alarmingly like some existing disease, but actually be quite different, or just be completely different. So, and I suppose looking at examples like HIV and Ebola and so on give you a bit of an idea of the
so I suppose
different problems that different pandemics would pose.
I suppose it goes back to a sort of you know, the preparedness thing about whether we want a general model of any pandemic. You know, of course, they're very, very different, or whether we want a sort of series of specialized models, you know, which you pull off the shelf when you identify what type of pathogen you're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, ideally you want something that's nice and flexible, but even within classes, I suppose. I mean, going back to what you were saying a minute ago, to me, part of the trouble here was that we don't, in in the UK anyway, we haven't had a big outbreak of anything really serious for a while. And part of the thought is that well, I mean, there was foot and mouth and so on, but the countries that responded better were those with more recent experience of things like SARS and MERS, which we managed to stay fairly well out of here, but probably by luck as much as anything else.
So I think this epidemic particularly has been a problem because of the vagueness of a lot of people either don't get any symptoms at all, or they get very mild symptoms, and a lot of the people are elderly that are dying, and it's
so not very visible.
It's very hard to perceive the risk. It's easy to perceive the risk. So even SARS, we went to Hong Kong, they've got a big memorial garden of lots of medical staff that died during. So it was a lot more obvious that a lot of young people were being affected and that you had a higher personal risk. And so I think it's made this particularly hard to deal with, especially for
well, that's
public.
I don't know if everyone's aware that one of the possible sort of spin-offs is the Bernard Silverman's suggestion that is COVID a wicked problem, meaning that it's one that just sort of sits on the edge of various boundaries, making it particularly difficult to decide what to do with, and particularly challenging for policymakers.
But I think
I tried to offer Bernard the counter argument that actually, almost all pandemics are wicked problems. I mean, there are wicked. I mean, there are wicked aspects, I think, to the whole preparedness and reacting at the early stage. That as I was trying to say earlier, it's you can see why it's very, very difficult to take the quotes right decisions at an early stage. I
suppose that's our job, is to de-wicked it, isn't it?
But what was interesting was when we had the talks on Ebola, that people were also trying to break quarantine on that, even though it's like a very, very obviously horrible disease that was killing all age groups quite rapidly. People were still trying to escape from the towns and trying to, not because they were escaping the disease, but because they still needed to go to work or they wanted to visit their relatives. So even when you've got something that's very obviously something that you don't want to spread, it's hard to communicate.
That's the argument of test, trace, isolate and support, isn't it? It's that last bit in terms of people have the incentives to do things that aren't in the public good, but are in the individual good.
Is the sort of structure of the draft reasonable, people think? I mean, it's got sort of the themes running through, which might largely perhaps make up an introduction, and then after that it's structured with the taking the sort of epidemic sequences, or preparation, emergence, interventions, and endemicity or elimination.
Yeah, I preferred the ones in brackets, the red ones, in terms of so preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery.
Yeah, no, that's well, that's yes. I'm trying to remember. It's yes, I've got a note somewhere of the various sort of headings that people have used, and I don't mind which. But if that structure is roughly right, and then I think under some of them there are some sort of phrases which more or less could be a challenge, and others are more just sort of series of notes or bullet points. Perhaps should be asking people if they're interested in a particular section, or if they just want to try a bit of developing, sharpening up particular parts, one section or.
Well, I don't know what Lisa had in mind, but it would. We've got a lot of bullet points at the moment. I mean, I like the structure, that we need to sort of focus on specific challenges and sort of get the bullet points.
I think that's what I'm meaning, Valerie. I mean, could we? I mean, but if we've got about, at the moment, we've got 4 sections. Can we in each of those identify ideally perhaps 2 or 3 more focused challenges that pick on them, the most important things we want to say there?
Yes, we also have to be mindful that we might not have captured everything in that section yet.
Absolutely. Sorry, and the other thing is obviously is to add anything that's got missed.
So is it useful just to have 5 minutes on each of those sections just to see if we haven't, there are any bits that we have missed out?
Yeah, good idea, Duncan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I think absolutely. Let's have the emphasis on things we've missed out rather than trying to hack away at what we've got. So the preparedness is, well, the overview. Are there any sort of themes running through? Again, some of those themes running through might actually turn into or help with 1 or more challenges, but
so I suppose, you know, the whole context of this is in terms of Go Science and SAGE essentially, and how that had been set up. So I suppose, are there any issues with the whole structure? And I think, is it Serian? Sorry, Kerian. Yeah, close enough. Was saying about, you know, there's the sort of expert mathematical modelers who are isolated from public health, and I think that was, and they're isolated from policymakers, and that's sort of presumably built into the structure. So you can sort of have a review of you know, the government advice about SAGE, essentially, about how it's structured and any weaknesses there. Because it's within a policy framework that all this is being done, and whether that's the right one. Because it's very hierarchical and bureaucratic and won't get policymakers working with modelers because it's not set up that way.
Yeah. Structure.
I wondered.
Sorry. Go on.
No, you go.
Well, I was going to change it slightly and say, I mean, there's also this question of work in between, as it was, in, you know, or not doing things and then not acting on results that come out of it, not really putting the infrastructure in properly in between things. So, I mean, things like SAGE are there presumably to be called on, as I understand it, all the time whenever there's some sort of emergency. So I don't know whether the structure that they need may be different depending on what that emergency actually is, and who is it that, or what body it is that sets up things like this Cygnus exercise, for example. I mean, is that Department of Health? Where do things like that sort of
well, I suppose it's Civil Contingency Secretariat within the Cabinet Office tend to have the responsibility with this. Yeah.
So I mean, all that needs to be sort of joined, doesn't it, as well?
Absolutely, and that's sort of the COBRA thing, isn't it? Really, it's the preparedness, which is Cabinet Office, and then there's the actual dealing with it, which is SAGE, and you know, you sort of assume they don't get on. Because, you know, we're policymakers, we're ministers, right? We know about this stuff. And at the other end, we've got, we're modelers, we know about this stuff. And getting people to you know, cooperate, I think, is the biggest challenge. And as I say, my sort of perception early on was just it's a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies aren't necessarily the best ways of responding to crises. They keep the minutes nice. And accountability is there for the public inquiry, but whether they actually solve the problem efficiently, I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We can add that in, certainly.
I missed the intros. Is anyone here on SAGE?
No.
Is anyone that is on stage volunteered to be part of this?
Well, I mean, the obvious person would be somebody like Julia, I suppose, but she never has time to be involved with anything. Well, I mean, she's doing so much, but we don't see her on these discussions.
I mean, Julia mentioned bullying on stage. It was somebody shouting quite loudly. She said, "You know who?" I didn't know who, but some quite aggressive discussions in Sage where basically the modelers are getting shouted at for coming up with non-feasible. So, I mean, obviously you can't put that in a paper. People shouldn't bully us, but mutual respect. But we're just guessing from the outside in relation to Sage.
We are. I don't know. I mean, the other person would be Graham Medley, but I don't know to what.
Lorenzo is Lorenzo's Palace.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, lots of them are on SPI-M. I don't know who actually.
I was on course.
Graham sent me something saying, "I'd love to be able to tell you in the future." When I was so whether he's able to kind of say now. I mean, he obviously knows what's going on. But,
well, I'm sure he does.
Yeah.
So I think like Graham and Julia would be really good. But I mean, you know, it may be that when we're a little bit further down the line, even if they can't, for these discussions, they could have a look at something that was written and make.
I think it would be easier for them. I mean, you know, if, as Graham is obviously implying, there's questions of confidentiality or whatever, I think it'd be much easier for him to comment on a draft than to be asked to write it himself.
Neither confirm nor deny that.
Bernard Silverman, I think, generically would be, and Frank Kelly, the two sort of people closely involved in statistics who've got experience of being top level government advisors.
The other thing I think it might be worth thinking a little bit here is, like Valerie mentioned, the sort of setup in New Zealand, and maybe a way of pointing fingers without pointing fingers is pointing out other ways that this could be done and where it has been done in other ways, and then sort of bringing that into the discussion.
I think we're bound to come at this a bit from our UK experience, or most of the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's not to say that it shouldn't be UK.
Equally, I mean, if we're trying to offer helpful generic advice, we've really got to try and transcend that. So, you know, I think the UK provides lots and lots of fruitful examples of places where, at least places in the structure where things can go wrong. Not you know, not saying that they necessarily did go wrong in all those places, but I think we should definitely be looking at, so far as we can, at a good range of international examples. And again, I mean, trying to be positive, I think it is much more about, I mean, I think you mentioned difficulties, but I think we're trying to look for, the challenge is to look for solutions, isn't it? Is to suggest how things should be done. And so
that's right.
One's essentially implicitly criticizing what was done this time, but without not.
No, I think we need to try and point at what works or what we think seems to work, without explicitly saying, but we didn't do this. People can draw their own conclusions on that. Sorry, Kerry-Ann, you were trying to say something a bit earlier.
Were there any international people interested in participating in this?
Sorry?
Were there any
international people?
Good question.
I don't know. I mean, Chris Dye was somebody who is on the list of people for this session. I don't know whether he's been interested. We've tried to interest him. I mean, he's not international in one sense, he's UK, but of course he's got a very broad international experience. I can't.
I guess the other way. Yeah.
We've got Andrew Dobston from Princeton on the list, and Peter Trapman. I don't know where he's from.
Sweden.
Peter's Stockholm.
But I think the rest of UK.
Even if people haven't expressed interest, the people who presented on kind of things over the course of the thing might be willing to, you know, if we sent a couple of questions just asking for a brief outline of kind of how things have worked or whatever, they might well be willing to contribute something like that, which would be useful. I would
Yes, well, we've had quite a lot of talks.
Exactly, yeah.
Aspects, haven't we? So.
Because are we trying to make I mean, it's very hard to make a general international paper, but is that the aim or UK based?
I think inevitably all of the papers will be UK based, because that's where most of the authors have their experience. But I think we should be looking as much as possible to make them, to have, you know, to learn lessons and to make sort of international comments. And where we've got people willing to participate, people like Andy and Mick Roberts in Auckland, and Hannah, of course, Ben Carl, you know, there are a variety and quite a lot of European people. So as much as possible, we'd be.
I suppose that's a point in itself, really, I suppose, in terms of we're quite parochial, as every other country is, in terms of looking at our problem, you know, from the modelling side and, you know, looking forward. I think it's an international problem that's been looked at as a 200, you know, isolated problem. So,
Well, that's why I'd really like to get Chris Dye a bit more involved, because Chris was quite an important position at WHO, and you know, and it's plain. I mean that, you know, just as they're the political, let's call it with a small p, political problems that we've seen in the structural advice in the UK, where it's although it's supposed to be science-based policy, it does seem to tend rather often to be policy-based science, and you know, and you do get, and there is a corresponding, I don't know if it's perhaps not very similar, problem with WHO. I mean, WHO in, you know, I mean, somehow seem to have combined a lot of really admirable stuff with doing several things, of delaying things, and then giving, frankly, duff advice. And you ask, what's going on? I mean, it's, you know, I think WHO are, I think they're put in a political position. What I'm trying to say is they're put in a political position, as scientific advisors in this country can be, and that they, you know, they do something like answer the wrong questions or whatever. I'm thinking particularly the advice about, I mean, WHO getting on the wrong side of the, whether it's useful to wear masks, and whether the and the role of aerosol transmission, where they were on the wrong side of both those points for a long time in a dogmatic way that there was absolutely no need to be. You know, they could have said this is probably, these are very likely helpful things, but of course there's the wider behavioural side, which is if you tell everybody to get FFP3 masks, then you don't have enough.
There won't be any.
But that was, I think, particularly in this country. I mean, that was, yeah. I mean, it was a failure of being honest. It was a failure of trusting the public.
But yeah, perhaps
it was a complete failure of trust, because I think if the government had said there's a shortage of high quality masks, which we must give priority to our doctors and nurses for, but we do think that just wearing a scarf or you know, 50 pence mask you can buy in a shop, you know, I mean, like for instance, I mean, Taiwan, I think, was actually giving away masks at an early stage, and if you know, that would have completely got around the problem if you just said, please don't buy posh masks because we need them for doctors, but we're giving out free masks, which we do recommend for everyday use.
I mean, of course, there were some interesting procurement decisions over here.
Yes. There's a wariness of litigation as well. So if you tell people to wear masks that aren't protective, when they could have got more protective masks, then can they then sue you because you gave them a mask that didn't work?
Yeah, but I think. Yeah.
But this
I'm
is,
going to have to go to see my
Sorry,
student.
Okay, thanks for all the
See you next week.
Terry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
and that's, I suppose, the whole behavioural SPI-B thing, as I mentioned before, not really being too included in the. Well,
Yeah.
my perception was.
But of course, one of the. Yes. Anyway, sorry, we were supposed to be looking at these sections. We've got.
Yes, sorry, we got sidetracked. But it's all good to have these discussions, and it's
So if we,
lots of different things that we can add in. So, shall we move on to a quick look at preparedness section?
yeah. So is there anything important missing there?
Yeah, basically anything that we want to add.
So I suppose, I kind of mentioned it, but the structure of, SAGE, is it the best structure?
Sorry,
Okay. Yep.
sorry, Duncan, what was that?
So the structure of SAGE, it's set up as a bureaucracy, and perhaps, comparing it to, say, New Zealand, they may have a different way of doing things, which integrates policymakers and modelers better.
Yes, I mean that's possibly a sort of overarching thing, really, isn't it? But
And maybe, I don't know, I think we've got it again as an overarching thing, but maybe the sort of international aspects of just international communication at an early stage where there's a lot to learn by good communications.
well, that's really just sort of. I think I would suggest that what that is that's a suggestion that the second bullet point under preparedness could be added to or
Yes.
explained.
Okay, happy
I
with that.
suppose there's, we're talking about the expertise from the modeller's point of view. There's also expertise from the policymakers and politicians type of view. And I suppose, how do you get politicians to have more evidence-based policy? But of course, that's their prerogative to decide.
Yeah.
And I suppose, the Cygnus thing is a good example of where it's designed to do that, but ultimately it's politicians who decide how seriously they're going to play.
Yeah.
And yeah. But it's an interesting, it is an interesting, I realize it's only one example and we ought to be comparing with what other countries did, but it's interesting really that you could have something which was, I think I'm right in saying, number one in the government's risk list. You could conduct an exercise on it which showed that you were no way ready to cope with that risk, and it could somehow become just a budget item in the sense that, someone suggests we should spend 30, I don't know what the sum was, but let's guess it was 30 million, let's say. Someone says we should spend some significant sum in a budget to improve the way we are prepared for the number one risk on our list. And somehow that got down to the level of a budgetary item that could get cut, basically, didn't it? That's what my understanding is that the civil servants got far enough of thinking of things you could do as a result of the Cygnus exercise to get us better prepared, and somehow our preparedness, if anything, went backwards because it got reduced to a budgeting level, I guess. That's, you see what I mean? It's
well, it's outside the time horizon of politicians, really, isn't it?
Sorry?
So it's outside the time horizon of politicians. It's not on my watch. It'll be on the next person's watch. So that's why it's interesting watching Jeremy Hunt cross-examine what's his name, Hancock. It's quite difficult to do that where of course on the select committee. But it's about the responsibility. So responsibility for the response was kind of put onto the modelers, Imperial for example, whereas it's in the context of it not being taken seriously, if you like, by politicians in the first place. So
I think I don't know what other countries are like, but I do think we have extraordinarily short-term politics for departments, because you have reshuffles of ministers. Jeremy Hunt was Minister of Health for 4 years or something, which is almost unprecedentedly long. There are lots of ministries where people are minister for only about 6 months or a year. So,
and maybe that links into the you know, mitigation type, the next sort of the response phase as well. That, you know, probably modelers are looking at a sort of longer term response interventions, which are longer term, whereas politicians are looking at the next PR cycle and what's, you know,
yeah,
of the sort of Scotch
Yeah.
egg type variety. It's the next headline, and you know, essentially lots of the interventions have been done for tomorrow's headline and to keep things out of public's mind.
Yeah.
So somewhere in that preparedness, we really need to mention sort of timescales, don't we? And that's
Yeah.
the basic point,
yeah,
isn't it, Duncan?
yes, I think so.
And I don't think, I can't see that's there at the moment. I'm not quite sure where
Yeah.
to mention it most helpfully, but that would be the thing to mention there. Anything else left out of preparedness? Giving
Well, I
people-
suppose there's the capacity. I don't know. Did we have enough modelling people? Probably we
Yeah.
did. I don't know. But are they the right type of modelling people? I don't know. And did we have a model, right? Did we have an off-the-shelf model which we could take and then run with?
in a way, you could say that in a world that worked well, you know, individual countries don't necessarily need to have that modelling expertise, you know, because it can be international. I mean, you need some modelling expertise perhaps in each country, so at least you have people who understand what modelling is. And
yeah, but that's the thing. Where is the government's, you know, pandemic model? It's in lots of different universities. There isn't, if you like, the state's model, and that's, you know, everybody can create their own model, but is it actually kind of becoming a better model in that process?
Well, as I excuse me, as I understand it, they both Imperial and the London School have a responsibility. They get grant money sort of permanently and have a responsibility to step up and be prepared to contribute. So I guess they keep models, as we know Imperial did with its flu model and so on. It's sort of updated and reasonably ready to roll.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry.
But whether that's broad enough, you know, I mean, you were talking about a model, but is a model what we ought to be aiming for, or a range?
Consensus. Yeah, exactly.
Because if we want, you know, thinking going forward, if we want flexibility to be able to tackle whatever gets thrown at us, just going for one model is almost certainly going to be the wrong one.
Exactly. And I suppose there's the other thing about, you know, the if you like, what's the word, the documentation of models, right? So, you know, the whole thing with Neil Ferguson was, you know, that whole thing, and even sorry,
I was only going to just say that the modelling group, and to some extent the estimation group, will be addressing some of that. I mean, that's not to say we don't want to talk about them here, but they will, those sort of issues about model documentation, for example, and reproducibility and lots of other things to do with that, and combining stuff from different models, all those sorts of issues are being picked up elsewhere too. So we can sort of liaise with them.
That's connecting up with a theme. I mean, one of the thoughts I've had sort of coming out of the Newton program and the pandemic generally is whether there are ways of better networking modelers in the future. And I think that this really touches on that, because I think is it really best to have a couple of, to have a couple of expert, and in normal times probably playing it slightly close to the chest, sort of expert modelers who have their model that they are responsible for, rather than a more open thing where as the code and public that helps public understanding of what the various models do, so that, for instance, if the best government advice is based on models that take no account of spatial geography, it's easy to find that out for a modelling group that wants to come along and say, here's an aspect of modelling that could be improved. See what I mean? There's a sort of
I think a lot of that will come out of thoughts from the modelling group or the estimation group.
Well, and the data. I'm sure the data.
And data, yes. Well, it's those, isn't it? It's all of those. So
but I think so. Yes, we perhaps don't need to say that much in this paper here, but I think that
but we need to link across.
We need to link across. So
make references to.
So support for fundamental epidemiology and modelling. Obviously could be expanded to include things like modelling transparency and support for cross-discipline modelling.
Well, and I suppose that also links into the kind of recovery phase going around in a circle, in that there are presumably huge links between modelling groups around the world, but in a year's time they won't be the same. So how do you preserve these sort of relationships going forward? Well, in 10 years anyway, 20 years.
Newton programs is one way. I mean, we've been connecting this group together since 93.
Oh, right. Okay. I stand very much corrected.
Well, we had at Newton, we had the first epidemic models program.
Right. Okay.
Beginning of 1993, and
but even that's worth probably putting down.
I mean, it's one way, but I mean, like all subjects, there are regular sort of conferences and so on, but usually they're a week or something. And the thing about the Newton programs is having these long programs.
Yeah.
And so the people we've been talking about, many of the people like Graham, Angela McLean, various others, were all involved in that first Newton program way back. And then, when we had another one in 20 years later in 2013, you're bringing in people like the next generation of people like Julia and so on.
And I suppose that's
so there is a continuity there, which is.
But it's as well as the kind of technical modelling, it's also the capability to respond and work with policymakers, which I think how that's done, I think is because that's a more difficult thing to take forward.
No, I'm only really talking about sort of the network of modelers, which I think is there and needs to be maintained, but the whole question of the interaction with policy is a whole different ballgame, and I don't think that's there at all.
Yeah.
Except perhaps through the CSAs.
Yeah,
I'm beginning to think that maybe there may be a couple of things these various things about collaboration are sort of an overarching theme, but should maybe be stated as a challenge. Challenges in collaboration, and you can maybe split that in two: collaboration among modelers and the scientific advice interface, connection between modelers and politicians.
Because I mean, I may be wrong, and but it seems though SAGE kind of has a problem and then goes to the experts, in this case modelling groups, but it's almost as a response rather than building up that. I suppose they, as you say, CSA should be connected into a wide network, but whether they are, I don't know. Because they need to be sort of a generalist essentially to be able to solve any problem that comes along.
Well, certainly Bernard and Frank might have something to add on that as sort of ex-CSAs themselves.
Okay. So maybe move on to mitigation, unless there's anything else.
Yep. How long do we want to go on for? Is anyone in a rush or?
No, we can go a little bit longer.
Quarter of an hour or something, if that works for other people.
Yes. For another time, I recommend taking a 5-minute coffee break in the middle. So
I wouldn't be getting
although these things are called coffee sessions, if you want coffee during them, you have to bring it at the beginning, ready for another. So if we actually, if we've got a lot to talk about, it may be better to agree in advance that at 11 o'clock we will definitely take up as long as it takes for everyone to go and make themselves a cup of coffee and think about something else for 5 minutes and come back fresh. anyway.
The only trouble with that is that we've got some people at least who are, you know, like who've already left. I mean, like Hannah, for example. And if people are squeezing it in, you don't want to use up their valuable time.
Oh no, I know. But anyway, but
anyway, let's carry on. Mitigation.
Sorry, it's my ignorance, but I always get confused with mitigation in terms of what is it. So it's prevention, right?
No, see, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's the same as emergence, really, is it? I think I want to stick with emergence.
I mean, emergence sounds like complex system stuff to me, so it's probably a bit.
Emergence. No, Duncan, emergence is absolutely crucial, because emergence is the stage at which you either recognise sufficiently promptly or fail to recognise sufficiently promptly that you've got a pandemic on your hands, and you know, and there's the and the difference in those kind of clued up and too laid back is exemplified by the way that I think I'm right in saying Taiwan banned flights from certainly Wuhan, if not the whole of mainland China, before the end of December. Right? Sorry?
There's almost detection, essentially.
Yeah.
It's getting established from.
Well, detect. Yes, if you want to. Yes, if you don't like emergence, detection would do.
Yeah, I think mitigation almost comes into sort of initial response or initial intervention would be to mitigate.
That's right. Yeah, I think emergence is really a bit before that. It's when it's coming across from the animal host and getting established in a human host. So it's sort of detection, and that's why I was raising the question of the sort of international connection, because you know, one needs to know what's going on in other areas and so on. I mean, other global areas.
And you know, it's having the capability to sense when it's going wrong. So once again, do you go through the bureaucracy of the World Health Organization and wait for the reports to come up from China and down to the UK, or do you build up this network of
So I guess it's surveillance, basically, isn't it? I mean, and having a mechanism for looking out for things by whatever means, by reports from the medical profession about things that they've noticed, or testing sewage regularly, or whatever, but ways of trying to spot things coming out of
it's network. It's both WHO and just I'm thinking that Eddie Holmes got onto it so quickly because he had contacts in Wuhan. Now, it's not a complete coincidence he had contacts in Wuhan, because he'd visited Wuhan partly because he was interested in the kind of diseases, flu or whatever, that came out of the wildlife trade in China, or that kind of thing. It was in other words, it was known as the kind of part of the world where you might get emerging diseases. I think,
but there's almost how do you get that systematically? So probably all of us could have had somebody who we'd known a friend of a friend who, but it's how do you systematically do that surveillance?
Exactly, and the question is how does that compare with doing it the official way? And
well, and I suppose I don't know how we actually detected it over here. In terms of those very early SAGE minutes, they're probably not through official channels. They're through.
Oh, you mean detected it sort of? So do you mean in the UK, or our response to?
Well, in terms of
problem,
so just people showing up at hospital.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the answer is not very well. I mean, we indeed. I mean, because I think there were, with hindsight, there were probably quite a few. I mean, dozens, hundreds of cases in the UK in January and February, and then the first official ones were, what, the end of January or in February, depending which part of the UK you're talking about. And I mean, the whole business of failing to detect that it was getting in from via Europe rather than directly from China. So, but I think, but that sort of, that's that sort of second stage of emergence. I guess that still counts emergence, but the first stage of emergence is where there was cases of the new disease were recognized as being suspicious, which happened in Wuhan in mid-December, and they alerted and I mean, that stage of things worked quite reasonably well, I think. I mean, I'm sure it could work better, but before the end of December, WHO had been told that there were some suspicious kinds of pneumonia, and I think
many of the medics, I was going to say many of the, you get the impression that many of the medics broadly in this country were certainly in January were, by whatever network knew about it and were looking out for it and thinking about implications and so on.
So
well, I mean, Eddie Holmes put out the sequence
very early, yeah,
on the 8th, which had been done in China, but he put it out on the. I mean, if you like, it was an inspired bit of leaking, really, because he wasn't then particularly authorized to do it, but he just put it out on the internet, so everyone had it on, I think, the 8th of January.
Right.
So anyone who was halfway expert after that knew that there was a new coronavirus which had caused some, few dozen cases anyway, in China. And although somehow official recognition that it spread between humans wasn't somehow officially recognized for a little bit later, I would have thought that experts would have assumed if you've got dozens of cases, that it must be spreading between humans, or it's very likely it's spreading between humans, and we should,
I think it was 22nd of January, Sage had its first meeting saying about, transmission. But that's not necessarily over here.
So there's the detection and recognition by international experts that you've got a new disease. Of course, that's different from saying it is actually going to spread around the world. But you would have thought some sort of precautions to try and mitigate or minimize that.
Yeah, precautions or detection on the grounds that if you do detect it, you can respond to it. I suppose the problem is if you do detect it and you can't respond to it, which may have been the case. So, there's a sort of general thing about more surveillance, but,
Yeah, well, I think that's right, because the more surveillance you've got, if you detect, you say you don't know, you may not be able to respond, but if all else fails, when you've only got a few cases, you can really clamp down for a bit while you stop and think, can't you?
Absolutely, close down the equivalent of Wuhan over here. Yeah.
So I mean, I think the emergence paper, theme 2 will be, among other things, looking at how quickly you can act at this stage in terms of working out the parameters of the disease and particularly trying to gauge its capacity for being a pandemic.
And I suppose this is where, sorry, to link into the modelling, so, do you need, or would it have been useful to have had a model to say that if this is correct, then these are the potential implications? I suppose, I don't know. Or is it it's probably obvious to the modelers, but it may not be obvious to policymakers at that stage. So do we need essentially the ability to say to policymakers that if this is true, then these are the potential outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of sort of exponential increase.
Well, yeah.
At the beginning,
yeah.
Which, you know,
I mean, maybe that's a thing. Maybe it's about communication. So modelers are probably not that good at communicating. They might produce a few charts, but, you know, visualize. I mean, at the beginning, how do you visualize this sort of process? And just, you know, where's the video that the modeling community has to say this is a exponential disease, or this is what a pandemic looks like.
yeah.
So you can,
well, so that, you know, and just pointing out the whole effect of doubling.
yeah, no, exactly. Something that
so
absolutely.
you know, the more you delay,
exactly, it's
the
this
worse.
sort of education thing,
Yeah.
if you like. So say, you know, this is the pack you build out, you know, to put in front of policymakers to say this is why it's important, and this is why it doesn't fit in your usual response time of, you know, kicking the can down the road, shall we say.
So I mean, another question. I mean, another question at this stage is I mean, another piece of bad WHO advice was at that early stage, WHO was saying, don't cut international air flights.
Yeah.
Which I think was bizarre. I mean, seems to be the only question was to what extent you know, which air flights is it useful to cut? It might not, you know.
I'm not sure what the reason was for that.
I mean, the Chinese, I think, stopped flights out of Wuhan fairly soon, but they probably, I think that was a Chinese fault. They didn't do it till late January.
But I think the WHO response was on the basis of that's what they expected to happen in this sort of disease, is that it wouldn't have any effect if you stopped international travel by any effect. I'm not sure what I mean by that, but I get the impression this was a playbook type thing, but I may be wrong.
Well, we got that. That seemed to be the argument here, because I remember lots of us were saying in February,
yeah,
you know, why are we letting people come in from
Italy,
China, and then little bit later,
Yeah.
why are we letting people come in from Italy, and
yeah,
without all the rest of it? And the argument seemed to be it wouldn't make any difference if we stopped it.
well, that's right, exactly.
And I never really understood
No,
that.
same
This
here.
idea that it's in the country, so it's going to spread. Yes, but
Well,
you know, if
I
you
think
clamp down the seeding, it must help.
It's especially when that
there
was,
must have been
at the
levels
same
of,
time.
there must have been levels of just simple data gathering that could have been done.
But
wasn't there? I mean,
that was roughly the same time when people coming off those flights were put into quarantine. So it's almost, you have it both ways. I'm yeah.
I mean, I
maybe
can see
that's
like
where, sorry,
I can see the economic drive, but
Yeah,
WHO
exactly.
are never required to. They're supposed to give the health advice,
Well,
right?
maybe it's to do with the sort of coordination of that response, that when you're going to do something that big, you need to coordinate it. Otherwise, there's a huge effect on the economy, or you need to do it in a controlled manner. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is the whole economic model. Yeah, I don't understand that either. So, you know, it's an interesting.
Coming back to the draft and things to expand. I mean, the final short sentence there, judging thresholds for action, was something I felt needs a lot of expansion. You know, there's a whole discussion to be had on judging thresholds for action, because you are talking about things like at what point, you know, at what if the Chinese, I mean, there was a Chinese fault, and this was a fault which connects up with you need to reward people for detecting a pandemic, not criticize them. You know what I mean? The officials in Wuhan, for whatever reason, I mean, China's system, love it or loathe it, works in some ways very well for suppressing pandemics, but part of it which goes wrong is that apparently public officials in China are very worried about being criticized if they are seen to have been in charge of something that went wrong.
As they are over here.
Well, yeah, okay. But well, maybe it's similar. But for whatever reason, my understanding is that Chinese officials in Wuhan in the first half of January felt they didn't want to tell people about this because it somehow reflected badly on them. Now, if we'd had a situation in which, on the contrary, public officials who are found to have made early detection of a potential pandemic were lavishly rewarded, they wouldn't have done that, would they? And so, for instance, they could have stopped all the travel out of Wuhan at the beginning of January, not on mid-January, whenever they did. I mean, it was 2 or 3 weeks, I think we're talking about, which would probably have quite a significant effect on the travel out. And then further thresholds, obviously, if that, and also that would have sent a signal to the world, watch out, there's something in Wuhan that we don't want to spread. And so hopefully other countries would have been thinking, do we need to stop some of our flights from China, or at least test people on them, or whatever the mitigation we might do. So that was a political failure to trigger a threshold for action. But there are other ones which are much more difficult, I guess, politically, where the whole, if I suppose lockdown would be coming.
Well, the threshold for action was too low, essentially. I mean, we did respond when it met a threshold, but that threshold was kind of, you could argue, too late.
Exactly. So I mean, the threshold for lockdown, obviously, in retrospect, was obviously set too high. But the broad question is, why do governments set the threshold for that kind of action too high? And I think it comes back to the whole business of not wanting to get egg on face because you've locked down and the thing fizzles out and people ask, why did we need to lock down?
Well, and especially in the sort of reaction to which was the disease where we overreacted. I forget, was it swine flu or foot and mouth? I don't know, one of them.
Swine flu.
But I do think it went bad beyond the degree to which it should have in this country. I must remember I do remember my jaw just dropping with I think it was Chris Whitty giving the explanation in March that the reason for not locking down at that stage was that people were going to have behavioural fatigue or whatever.
Well, exactly, and that goes back to where that came from, and that was.
But I mean, and that was
the pollution of the scientific advice. I would argue.
Sorry.
I would argue is the pollution of the scientific advice, because nobody has owned up to that concept.
No, I mean, when you hear the behaviour of people, which we have done, talking about that, they say
not us.
They don't know. Yes, they say they don't know where that came from. Yeah, so who did make up? Is this a civil servant thing, or?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean,
But I mean, not being a behavioural scientist and not being a behavioural scientist and therefore prepared to believe that possibly there was a thing called behavioural fatigue, I didn't even need to get out the back of an envelope to do a calculation to suggest that the argument was cockeyed, because.
But that's when you have to work out. If
you leave the lockdown 2 more weeks, you've got 10 times as many cases, so the lockdown is going to have to be for longer. So if you're thinking about behavioural fatigue, people will only put up with a certain length of lockdown. The sooner you do it, the better.
I think
the sooner you do it, the shorter the lockdown could be.
I think my point on that would be to make sure that the scientific experts on SAGE are indeed scientific experts. So,
well, it's back to this understanding an exponential properly, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But there was, if you look at who's been described as, you had Dido Harding, as I said before, and people like this. Dominic Cummings was there. So you've got to think about Ben Warner from, these are not scientific experts. They're kind of pseudo. They're in that committee, and should it be essentially an expert committee which is devoid of politics? Probably yes, if you want the best advice. And so it's a sort of general point, that keep it pure expertise, if you like, rather than. And I suppose there's this risk of modelers or scientific experts wanting to be policy advisors, or to think that I was, I don't know. There's a sort of tension between, the other side always seems more exciting, to implement policy or to be.
I think that the whole thing, it's just ridiculously long chains of command. I mean, it would have been far more. I think it would have been far more useful at that sort of stage to have tried to select 3 or 4 scientists with broad expertise, so perhaps one behavioural one and at least one epidemic modeler, and I don't know who for them, whatever, and to have said, actually, this is potentially sufficiently serious. We're giving you an hour with the Prime Minister.
I'm not sure that would help.
No, seriously, I mean, but the point is that the decision on lockdown was ultimately taken by the Prime Minister. But how many layers did he get filtered through?
The responsibility is the Prime Minister's, but who actually made that decision, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, yes. Yeah.
And that's the point. The scientists are put up as the front people for the decision. You know, it's essentially that scientist told me to lock down, therefore we're doing it. So we are following the science, even though, of course, Hancock, a couple of weeks ago said we weren't actually following the science. So it's about the responsibility in terms of, you know, it's a political kind of distancing from the decision. So, you know, how can you go against expert advice, essentially, is it, you know? So there's that whole thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
moving on.
Should we look quickly at intervention, response, and recovery response?
Very quickly. Intervention's going to I mean, there's a whole challenges paper on interventions. So there'll be a need to sort of decide what we want to put here and what we just cross-refer to that.
I don't know. I mean, something that's kind of, I don't know, fairly, I wouldn't say interesting, but is the thing about what sort of spatial resolution do you do all this stuff? Yeah, because once you set up a model and you put things like counties in it, then suddenly you're kind of constraining the, you know, the effects. So, you know, sometimes I think, you know, looking at some of the models, they are, you know, taking, say, counties as a unit of measurement where there's no justification for that. It's just sort of, you may have the data for it potentially, and therefore the interventions follow from the model scale, if you like.
Yeah.
Are the modelers using counties? I mean, I know that the current tier thing is using counties, but I assumed that was sort of, you know, by aggregating up rather than working at that high level.
Well, certainly the London School, the original model was using counties. But as you say, it was so it ran a SIR type model on an individual county, but then, as you say, aggregated them to get the epidemic from the country.
But it was counties, because I was assuming it was at a finer granularity than that, but then aggregated to county that. But I don't know about that. I meant just in general that I thought this.
Yeah. So that's the one I probably have looked at most, and I'm sure there are other ones that, but there's that spatial resolution, and very often it's, you know, driven by the fact that you can run it on your laptop rather than any other reason.
Well, I guess it starts from the country, you know, SIR model, and then just trying to put in heterogeneity. So they put in age, and then they try to put in some sort of spatial resolution on the grounds that something must be better than nothing. And
it's interesting because, you know, looking at it from a kind of outside without knowing what models were set up. I mean, there were the sort of contact matrices ones, which were basically about transmission. But you know, the whole thing about network models didn't come in until relatively late on, I don't think. And then certainly Oxford says it's doing something about it, but the sort of agent-based models, and so, you know, modeling individuals essentially. So, but each of those requires its own data essentially, and you know, it's almost that the models followed the data that you had. And this is perhaps about the preparedness thing, about how do you get the data, the ideal data set that would allow you to make a better model in the future.
I think I have a suggestion for next week's homework.
Go ahead.
Which is that we should each produce our list of single sentences that are could be the names of the challenge sections. Okay, so I mean, so typical challenges paper maybe has 6 or preferably not more than about 10 challenges, and I think in some cases, if I'm doing this, I would probably just pick on some sentences that are already there in the draft and say, that's one of the challenges. But there are others where I feel we've got half a dozen sentences which could perhaps be pulled together into a single sentence saying what the challenge is. And if we each did that separately without consulting each other,
Oh yeah, and then group them.
Then we could look at each other's lists next week, or well, hopefully maybe look at each other's lists before next week, and see if we agree in identifying the things, or see if we're really all looking at it from either we're thinking some things important which other people don't think are important, or if we're just looking at things in different ways, in which case we can discuss which is the best way of, which is going to be the most helpful way of looking at them. And I suppose the second bit of homework really would be references for any of these points that we're homing in on as being important, particularly things I think which have examples of other countries that did things better or differently. Lisa, what would you add to
Yeah,
that?
I think that's a nice idea. How many? So you're thinking 6 to 10
Well,
from any of the four?
That's a ballpark figure. I mean, if we come up with 20, I would suggest that we would later on want to be trying to boil them down and amalgamate them. If we come up with 2 or 3, I would be suggesting we maybe want to be splitting them up.
So I suppose in order for us to do that, it's useful to know exactly what we're trying to answer in terms of these are the challenges, or this is what we need to do essentially to make a better hash of it next time.
I think we don't necessarily need to solve all the challenges.
Yeah.
And I think also we should probably err slightly on the generous side in the number of challenges, because I do think it's important to put down challenges, even if they're really challenges for international politicians or rather than for us. I mean, I think this stuff about getting a more collaborative international framework for getting some kind of international support for WHO, which doesn't as lean on WHO, so WHO feels it has to please the countries that fund it. You know, I do think those are probably important things to say if we agree with them, but they're not things that we want to go into at any length. So I mean, I think if you have points like that we want to make, they perhaps could be made in the introductory section. You know, we could towards the end of the introductory section, we could say the following sections focus on challenges where we feel modelers can contribute, but we are aware that there's some challenges which are really for other people to sort out. And here, you know, list of bullet points are some challenges for other people to sort out.
I think also having erring on the generous side is probably a good idea, because some of them we'll probably decide are better dealt with in other papers, and we just want to have a sentence and a cross-reference rather than you know.
Absolutely. So indeed, if you put down a challenge, you're welcome to put in brackets afterwards, perhaps this belongs in the interventions paper or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's going to go around to the list essentially to say, can we?
Lisa, can you write something?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And can we confirm? Are we going to meet at the same time?
Yes.
Because I think several people said that although this Tuesday wasn't particularly convenient, Tuesdays in general were
the least bad option.
So if we could tell people we're penciling in the next few Tuesday mornings.
And therefore, you know, the sort of putting a few sort of up until Christmas at least, I suppose, the meetings in the diaries, then people can avoid this time.
Yeah, exactly.
That'd be good.
Yes, I can do that. So first I'll add in what we've discussed, and then I'll send it around for people to make their own lists.
Super.
Okay.
And is that coming to you, or do people want to include it in the document, if you like?
What our thoughts for how to group them?
Well, just the 10 responses from each person, essentially.
I think you.
I don't know.
I think you should. I think people can put them as the classic one. Hopefully, the classic 1 page of A4 into the Dropbox, the challenge 10. But perhaps if we ask people not to do it before the weekend, Well,
Or-
to do it at the end of the week. How
I mean,
about ask people to do it any time from, but not immediately, because I think it's, as I said, I think we should each try and think about this independently for a day or two. So
it's more work for Lisa, but is it just saying reply to you with the 10 points? That's
yeah,
probably
That might,
people
that
more
might
likely
be
to
the
do it.
best, really.
yeah,
And
okay.
then-
And then I can collate, I can make a large tally.
And Lisa can,
Yeah.
And then it
Drop off
anonymizes them as well,
weekend.
so we don't have to look silly.
That's good. I like that one.
Yeah, it also might just be less confusing than having a lot of different versions in the Dropbox.
I think so, if Lisa doesn't mind.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
and if when you get them, you want to do a bit of shuffling or what commentary or whatever, you're welcome. But or if you just want to pass them on.
So if we could, we're on Tuesday, aren't we? So if people could get them to Lisa by the end of the weekend,
Yeah.
or first thing Monday latest or something,
Yeah.
so she's got.
Well, if you just
24 hours.
say get them to Lisa if possible by the weekend.
Yeah, well, actually, yes, it could be any time, couldn't it? But-
It's a vague deadline.
I was just, well, I was trying to put an end point. Obviously,
Yes,
it could be
yes.
sooner, but it was so that she
That's right,
wasn't
exactly.
getting everything at
Absolutely.
5 to 10 next
Yeah.
Tuesday morning.
Or during the next meeting. That's all.
Yes,
Yeah.
quite.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah, that seems like a good way
Very
forwards.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Thank
all.
you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll stop
Okay.
recording.
Yes, I think we've got that, and so that should be somewhere for any of us if we need it.